Hello, it's Daniel Rosney here on a mission to learn more about the monarchs who reign over more than 40 countries in the world. There are different types of monarchy in 2025: constitutional, ceremonial, absolute, and there are some elected as well. Although the majority are, not all monarchs are kings, but they are all men. There's a Grand Duke, there's an emperor, there are a couple of princes, there's some sultans and emirs, and there is the Pope. Yes, the Pope is a monarch. The man leading the Catholic Church is head of the Vatican City state and is a sovereign. While he isn't a member of a royal family and wasn't born as a prince into a palace or into power, the role he has as a monarch and as a leader of roughly 1.4 billion Catholics is more than just the head of the church. He's similar, I guess, to King Charles III of the United Kingdom, who has multiple roles, one as head of state and another as head of a church. In Charles's case, the head of the Church of England. On this episode of It's Raining Men, we're going to look at Pope Francis of the Vatican City. First things first, at the time of recording, Pope Francis has been in hospital for a week. He's 88 and was admitted with a respiratory infection and has been diagnosed with pneumonia in both lungs. Things can obviously change quickly with his advancing age and ill health, and there won't be speculation about those circumstances, but we are going to learn more about him as an elected monarch, because they exist. The Vatican City isn't the only one with an elected monarchy. Cambodia, Malaysia, and the United Arab Emirates are other nations that use the system, some for 5 years, others are elected for life. Normally, the Pope is elected as a monarch for life, although the predecessor to Pope Francis, Benedict XVI, abdicated in 2013 due to advancing age. That hadn't happened since 1415, and he was the first to do so voluntary since 1294. It was a huge deal. So after the shock abdication in 2013, which other monarchs have chosen to do, stepping down as they get older, which we've explored in the Denmark and the Luxembourg episodes, Francis was elected. At the time, he was seen as a complete outsider, and being from Argentina, he's the first Latin American to take on the papacy. Catholics view him relatively favourably in 2025, but over his more than a decade as Pope, there has been a mixed bag of support and also criticism. He's seen by some as liberal. For example, he said LGBT people should be welcome in the church, but he's also seen as conservative. He's unsurprisingly against abortion and hasn't allowed women to become priests. We're not going to get into the detail on doctrine or other religious discussions on this podcast, but we are going to look at perhaps one of the most influential monarchs on the planet. To help me is Colleen Dulle, the host of the podcast Inside the Vatican, which is a weekly series discussing everything that goes on in the very secretive Vatican City. Colleen, I guess it must be very similar to reporting on other monarchies that have palaces in that the information must be so difficult to come by.
It's not the kind of journalism that I was trained to do in college, in journalism school, right? You get there and you realize that kind of everybody's constantly having these off-record conversations and people are dropping little bits of information to see what information somebody else has. The Vatican is a major diplomatic force, and I don't think people realize that. They have nuncios, they call them, so ambassadors in a bunch of countries. There are very few countries that don't have diplomatic relations with the Holy See at this point.
There is this Oscar-nominated film, Conclave, which I think is up for 8 awards. And the plot of this is essentially electing a pope. So for those who haven't seen it, how do you become a pope?
Depends where you want to start. I guess we can start with the death of the previous pope. Basically, once the death of the pope is confirmed, which there are all of these very old traditions around how they do that, they'll proclaim that the Holy See, the seat of power of the Catholic Church, is vacant, and you'll have the papal funeral, and then all of the cardinals will usually come to Rome for that. Then in advance of the conclave, there are a few days of pre-conclave meetings. These are called general congregations. They're presided over by the dean of the College of Cardinals, who, if you've seen the movie Conclave, is Cardinal Lawrence, Ray Fiennes' character. It'll be he just confirmed Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re as the Dean of the College of Cardinals, although interestingly, he's actually too old to participate in the conclave. So when a conclave does come around, it will be the Cardinal Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, running things in the room, in the Sistine Chapel.
And is that because you have to be younger than 80?
Yeah, exactly. The cardinals are locked in the Sistine Chapel with a key, hence the name conclave, right? And they vote a couple times a day until they reach a 2/3 majority for a new pope. They can technically elect any Catholic man, so you don't have to be a priest or a cardinal. I don't know if you're Catholic, Daniel. You could be
I am
pope.
Catholic. I could be pope. This is news to me. This is news to me.
I could not, which is not very fair.
I had never considered that I could be a pope one day.
Yeah, man. Dream big. Yeah, so anyway, and as we all know, once they have chosen someone, he chooses a new name. They send up white smoke from the Sistine Chapel. We've all kind of followed that on the news in the past.
But all of that is a secret process.
Yes.
And they won't even say who they voted for.
No.
As somebody that follows international politics, where I'm used to kind of some sort of campaign, it's all completely secret. So I don't understand how somebody can get a majority if there is no campaign.
Yeah, I mean, there's this very weird dynamic, and I've covered this as regards women's advancement in the Roman Curia, especially. There's this strong attitude, sort of taboo against campaigning, against ambition. At the same time, as you know from the movie Conclave, right? Everybody still has that in them. And so there's this interesting element where people are like, campaigning but not. You'll have someone's supporters kind of vouching for them. So Francis had a group of supporters going into the last conclave, even though he didn't really want to be pope. In terms of revealing vote counts and who people voted for, it's actually punishable by excommunication, like automatic excommunication. So if you tell somebody, you're technically not allowed to receive communion in the Catholic Church anymore. However, my podcast co-host, Jerry O'Connell, wrote the definitive book that included vote counts from every single ballot in the last conclave. And he has all these stories from the inside. So again, with Vatican reporting, it's all about building connections, building sources that can trust you. He had to wait like a certain number of years after the Pope was elected to put this book out. I think he waited 5 years. I have it right here. I'll plug it. It's The Election of Pope Francis, an inside account of the conclave that changed history by Gerard O'Connell. There you go.
I love an inside scoop. But going back to Francis, what kind of role, responsibility, duties does he carry out as monarch of the Vatican City state?
Well, he's the supreme legislator, right? He is himself the final arbiter of judicial decisions. I mean, in practice, as I imagine with other monarchies, most of this is delegated out. So there is a Vatican tribunal that is part of their judicial system. That's where court cases are heard. There is obviously a whole system of canon law, and the Pope is able to change that.
And what kind of leader has Pope Francis been? Because he's unlike a lot of the other monarchs that we have in the world in that he wasn't born into that position. He didn't always know he was going to be monarch.
The Pope's been really interesting compared with other monarchs in that he really favors the decentralization of power. He's made a lot of efforts to kind of delegate power, delegate authority to local bishops' conferences, for example. Generally, he's moved power away from Rome and the Church, with one exception, which is a notable exception, the regulations that he put on the old Latin Mass, because he was concerned that those were becoming kind of ideological hotspot. And he said, no, this needs to be regulated through us in Rome. He's put a lot of energy, especially into dialogue with the Muslim world. Especially, he's very close with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, who is one of the most respected leaders in Sunni Islam. They signed an important pact on human fraternity together a few years ago. Just the other day, since the Pope is currently in the hospital, we heard from the Grand Imam that he was praying for the Pope. And then, his papacy has very much been a reforming one, which I think has been the mandate of previous popes as well, although they've struggled to get it done, and Francis has struggled in some ways to get it done as well. But I think the key reforms on his part are financial reforms, trying to make the Vatican more financially accountable, especially to like international groups like Moneyval. That's a push that Benedict started, but Francis has continued. He did a big reform of the Roman Curia, again, the churchy offices, in which he took the office that used to be the Holy Office of the Inquisition, also known as La Suprema for many years because it was the highest ranking office. It's the Vatican's doctrine office. He moved that to the number 2 role and placed evangelization at number 1, which is a huge signifier of what his priority is, right? That he cares more about getting the message of the gospel of Christianity out rather than enforcing doctrine. Not that it's not a priority, but that it's no longer the number 1.
And he's also going to parts of the world where Catholicism isn't necessarily the main practice religion there. He's in hospital now, but he's recently done huge trips in Asia, and he's been traveling around Europe as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's really prioritized that. I think maybe to the chagrin of some Catholics who would love to see him visit their countries and have kind of assumed that a papal trip is a given how many Catholics are there. So we've seen the Pope prioritize, on one hand, places with very few Christians that just were never Christianized, right? And then on the other hand, places where religious disaffiliation has gotten really big. One example that I think touches with this podcast is his recent trip to Belgium, where we've seen lots of disaffiliation from the Catholic Church. And that's a monarchy that previously had really close ties to the Vatican, to the Holy See. The Pope faced a lot of criticism for going to Belgium and speaking favorably about their king who refused to sign into law an abortion law.
On that trip to Belgium, we actually spoke about this
Mm-hmm.
on the Luxembourg episode.
Because he also went to Luxembourg on that trip.
Yeah, but we were discussing how the current Grand Duke of Luxembourg refused to sign a bill around euthanasia, and that was very similar to the previous king
That's right.
of Belgium, who refused to sign a bill around abortion.
Yep.
And the Vatican was in favor of these two monarchs.
And I think that complicates his relationship with other world leaders because it's difficult to tell sometimes whether he's acting in his role as a head of state or as a religious leader. Certainly, he sees himself primarily as a religious and spiritual leader and as like a moral leader, but a government like China's, for example, which has had such a challenging dialogue with the Vatican for so long, they see him as strictly political. They are approaching him as if, the decisions he makes are not motivated by any kind of moral desire or anything. They think that he just wants to watch out for his own people, the Catholics.
Before I let you go, I just want to ask about the previous president of the United States, Joe Biden. He was a Catholic man. Donald Trump, the current president, isn't a Catholic man. How important is that in terms of influence with what's going on in the world right now? Because, I follow the Pope on social media, and weekly, if not daily, there is a call for peace at the various conflicts that are happening around the world. But if he doesn't have the ear of world leaders at the top table, how influential can he be?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and there's several elements of it. I think in terms of Joe Biden's Catholicism, he mostly governed without a lot of visible influence from the Pope, but in his last few months as president, when he was a lame duck president, there were a number of initiatives that he pushed through that seemed to be directly influenced by the Holy See, by the Vatican. One is this deal that was made with Cuba, that a cardinal from the U.S. has said that he carried messages back and forth between the U.S. and the Pope to broker this, but basically, in return for the U.S. taking Cuba off of its list of state sponsors of terrorism, the Cubans were going to release X number of political prisoners. Of course, on Trump's first day in office, he relisted them as a state sponsor of terror. There were already some prisoners released, unclear if there's going to be more. And then the other one was commuting a bunch of federal death penalty sentences, which there was a strong push from also a US-based group, the Catholic Mobilizing Network, that's against the death penalty. They got a message through the Pope. The Pope then contacted Biden, encouraged him to commute these sentences, and he did. Now, moving on to the peace question, it's a challenge. The Pope is very interested in peace. At the same time, I'm thinking especially of, okay, let's look at the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, right? The war in Ukraine, the Pope has a lot of support from the Ukrainians. He has a good relationship with Zelensky, but Vladimir Putin is very closely aligned with Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill. Kirill has blessed the war in Ukraine, said that it's totally legitimate, and so the Vatican's had a really difficult time getting any connection with Moscow. The one thing that they've been able to accomplish through their humanitarian work has been to get some of the miners who were removed from Ukraine reunited with their families. Oftentimes, the humanitarian work is a point of connection and a point where they're able to cooperate a little bit, even if they disagree on much bigger things. In terms of the Israel-Hamas war, this Pope had very, very good relations, especially compared to his predecessor, with Jewish leaders for a long time. But after October 7th, the Pope became very outspoken in support of the Palestinians. He calls the Holy Family Parish in Gaza every night. He even has while he's been in the hospital right now. And so that has lost him a lot of support among the Israelis, who, I think he would be aligned on some things with otherwise. But he's been so critical of them that, again, I think that that's lost him some ability to broker any kind of dialogue. He's been a strong advocate of humanitarian aid going in. He's been a strong critic of the U.S.'s role in funding this war and sending weapons. But yeah, the peace question is a challenge, and I think the challenge especially comes when, his moral authority seems to be causing him to take a certain side.
I guess there's a much more deep dive into this on Inside the Vatican, which is released weekly. Is that right?
Yeah, comes out every week on Thursdays.
I'll put a link to the podcast in the description of this episode. Thank you so much, Colleen. It's been a pleasure learning more about the Pope's role internationally and domestically as well, I guess.
Thanks so much, Daniel.
Coming up, we're going to look at some of the big issues Francis has tried to tackle as Pope, and there will be some mention of sexual abuse in the church. So if you're listening with children or that topic isn't for you, there are more monarchs we've profiled in our podcast feed that might be more suitable. Just the weekend before the Pope was hospitalised, I was in Rome and I went to a mass on St. Peter's Square. It's a Jubilee year in the Catholic Church, and that is a big deal. This happens every 25 years, and the expectation is that tens of millions will travel to the Vatican throughout 2025 to pass through the Holy Door to feel closer to Jesus. It's a huge bronze panel door that is normally closed, but on Christmas Eve, Pope Francis opened it for the year. I didn't actually get a chance to walk through the door myself, so I don't know whether or not that means I'm not as close to Jesus as others. But in the crowd on St. Peter's Square, there were around 50,000 people at the Mass. People had travelled from all over. There were flags from Ireland, Argentina, some from the US and Panama as well. The vast majority, though, were Italians, perhaps unsurprising. The Vatican City is the smallest sovereign state in the world, but it is constantly making headlines. Right now, it is obviously around Pope Francis being in hospital, but in the past year, he's had to apologise for using a gay slur. As Colleen mentioned, his visit to Belgium was controversial, and he added to that by suggesting that King Boudouin, who in 1990 refused to sign a law around abortion, which Parliament had approved, should become a saint. It keeps journalists busy, like Charles Collins, who is the managing editor of Crux now, which provides independent news coverage of the Vatican. Charles, you've covered 3 popes, including Francis. What is it like covering his papacy?
I did work for him for a while. You have to understand there are 2 things that are there. There's what's called the Holy See, which is what the ambassadors to. It's to the Holy See. It's where, if you're outside the Vatican City, you're in territory owned by the Vatican See, not by own Vatican City. Vatican City doesn't go out of what Vatican City is. And he's the head of Vatican City. That only exists because that's the only way that you can have an archbishop that doesn't have control by another country. So the only way they could do that was establish Vatican City. They didn't have to worry about it because they used to have the state. When they lost the state, they had to figure out how to make sure that the Pope didn't have to answer to another figure. And they did that by establishing Vatican City, and that took about 70 years to do. And Vatican City is just where the Pope lives, and maybe a few hundred other people, most of them priests, live. And it's got a supermarket.
It has a supermarket.
Yeah, it's got the best wine selection you can find in Rome, I'll tell you that. And, he's got a shop. It used to have a really good place for people who like to smoke, but Pope Francis stopped them selling cigarettes. You can still get a cigar there, though.
I guess that's a small example of something he's changed in the Vatican City. But to get serious now, what has Pope Francis done that has been different to his predecessors to try to ensure that the role of the Catholic Church fits into a modern society?
The Catholic Church has had problems dealing with the rise of LGBT people in society. It was easy to have the standard Catholic teachings when everything was illegal, and society was opposed to it. Now you have to deal with the idea that the Catholic Church thinks that marriage has to be between men and women. It also thinks that sexuality has to be between married people. In many ways, that's the tougher thing for the Catholic Church to do, is to say you can't have sex before marriage. And it's failed miserably on that. And this is a complex issue. What Pope Francis has said is you have to treat people like people. If you want to cut it down into English words, you have to give a gay couple the exact same respect and treatment you would give someone who was married outside of the church, which there's a lot of people going to Catholic masses who are remarried after a divorce, and they aren't married in the church, and they get treated fairly normally. And according to what the Catholic Church says, they're doing the same thing as a gay couple are doing. So I think he's just trying to say we have to treat people the same. He's passed a few things saying, yes, if a gay couple comes up to you, you can bless them as you would bless if a non-married couple came up to you and asked for a blessing, which is you bless them as people. He hasn't changed church teaching. I mean, the big problem that Pope Francis has had is that he's been a very open down kind of guy. And this kind of comes from being from Argentina, because that's the kind of society they are. It's top down. He makes the rules. Everyone has to do what he says. I'll make an opinion and it matters. And this has really hurt him with sex abuse, because he's passed a lot of good laws to fight sex abuse in the church. When it comes to a lot of the bishops who've been accused, he's believed them over the victims. When he talked about changes in the church, he was elected to stop the abuse crisis. He instead moved to more social issues. And a lot of people have supported him in these social issues. But a lot of people are going, this is not what we elected you for. And so the next pope, and there will be a next pope, has to deal with those issues that haven't been dealt with for 11 years.
But how can they find the right person to lead the church and lead the Vatican state? Because there are 1.4 billion Catholics in the world, but the tiny pool of people that can become pope can't campaign.
100,000-ish priests. That's 100,000 guys who decided they wanted to serve God, and they read a lot of books in school, and they probably weren't on a lot of football teams. That's your pool. And from that pool, you pick bishops. And that's an even smaller pool. And from that pool, you pull cardinals. And that's a way smaller pool. And from that pool, you pick a pope. And that means right now about 130-ish men, if it happened today, are candidates. And I'm going to say probably half of them at least are complete no-goes. We hope God takes his role and says, hey, what about that guy? But as all Catholics have, pick a few guys that they thought he didn't pick. But you see the candidates go out every time the cardinals come into Rome for a meeting, which they do about once a year. They all have lunch together, and it comes up. And it's come up since he was elected, because he was in his late 70s when he was elected. So everyone thought he was going to die in 2 years. Trust me, when he's in 88, they still come together and they discuss it. Some are saying we need someone who needs to promote what Pope Francis has done, and some are saying we need to fix what he's done. But no one wants a new Francis. They don't want lots of changes. They want someone to fix the problems that Francis didn't fix.
There are so many ways he's different to the other monarchs we're profiling on this series, because the vast majority of those are head of state of a country, and that's who they have influence over, whereas Pope Francis has influence over a religion around the world that has 1.4 billion Catholics.
That influence is not really how you think of him as a monarch. People think when he's the monarch, they think of Vatican City, the Vatican City state. And even the Vatican, they acknowledge he's a monarch because there are certain privileges they get for it, but they don't like to think of him as a monarch in that way. And a lot of this is before what our idea of a monarch became, because it wasn't until really the 1600s that our idea of what makes you a powerful leader really formed.
Well, Charles, I think we're discovering on It's Raining Men that the role of a monarch is ever-changing as society evolves. Thank you so much for your time. And while the Pope is a monarch, he isn't a king, he's not a sultan, he is a Bishop of Rome. He has relationships with other monarchs, close ties, for example, to the King of Spain and the Grand Duke of Luxembourg. And the King and Queen of the United Kingdom are expected to make a state visit to the Vatican City in April. And we're actually going to look at what it's like organising a state visit on a future episode of It's Raining Men. So if you've got any questions around that, our email is itsrainingmenpod@gmail.com. Now, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe if you're not doing so already, and rate us on whatever platform you're listening. If you're new, welcome along. And here's a flavour of what you've missed so far if you want to go back and catch up. We began with King Frederick X of Denmark a year into his reign.
He was not comfortable with the new role yet. So the speeches were very shaky and he didn't really know how to do it.
Then we looked at King Carl XVI Gustaf of Sweden, who's Europe's longest serving monarch.
I could never have predicted how often the king would talk about being alone or about loneliness.
Next was King Abdullah II of Jordan, who is also in the news a lot at the moment as a key player in maintaining stability in the Middle East.
Many felt that he was, more comfortable maybe living abroad in the military, not so much in governance.
Our fourth episode was on Grand Duke Henri of Luxembourg, who is stepping down in October.
He was never really at ease with these kind of representative functions that come with his role. It's interesting. His personality is actually a personality that is more introspect.
And finally, there's King Harald V of Norway to catch up on, who is facing huge controversies in his family with allegations of rape, which is casting a cloud over the monarchy.
The king is the one who's given the monarchy a reason to exist into the future. King Harold is the one that has saved the future of the monarchy.
Thank you for listening to It's Raining Men. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends who also might be interested in kings, queens, power and palaces. And it would be great if you could subscribe so more episodes appear in your feed as soon as they're ready. And if you want to suggest a topic to be explored or have any questions about monarchies or specific members of royal families, you can find us on social media. Just search It's Raining Men. There's also a weekly newsletter on Substack too. Speak soon.